Alice was stoked about her new apartment. Big windows, great location. It felt like a fresh start. She spent the afternoon unpacking boxes. As the sun set, she took a break, gazing out the window. That's when she saw him. A man, just staring up at her building. Something about him sent a shiver down her spine. His smile was too wide. Alice tried to shake off the uneasy feeling. Just a coincidence, she muttered, turning away. She busied herself with unpacking, but couldn't shake his grin. As darkness fell, Alice drew the curtains. She told herself it was just big city paranoia. The next morning, Alice woke up with a start. She couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching her. She cautiously peeked through the curtains, but didn't see the man from the previous night. Relieved, she decided to head out for some coffee, hoping to clear her head. As she left her apartment building, she glanced across the street. Her breath caught in her throat. The man was back, standing in the exact same spot as before, his unwavering smile sending chills down her spine. He was facing her building, but his gaze seemed fixed on something higher up, closer to her apartment. Alice hurried down the street, her heart pounding in her chest. She couldn't explain it, but she felt a growing sense of dread, a certainty that the man's presence was somehow connected to her. Throughout the day, the image of the man's smile lingered in Alice's mind. She tried to rationalize it, to convince herself it was all just a strange coincidence. But deep down, a primal fear was beginning to take root. That night, Alice's unease intensified. She drew the curtains tightly shut, but she couldn't shake the feeling of the man's eyes on her. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of leaves outside her window sent shivers down her spine. Unable to sleep, she found herself drawn back to the window. Cautiously, she peered through a small gap in the curtains. The streetlight across the street illuminated the sidewalk below, and there he was. The man was closer now, standing directly across from her building, his eyes fixed on her window. His smile seemed wider than before, more grotesque, as if it were stretched beyond the limits of a human face. Alice recoiled from the window, her heart pounding in her chest. Fear, cold and sharp, coursed through her veins. She knew she should call someone, tell someone what was happening. But what could she say? That a man with a creepy smile was standing outside her apartment? She imagined the dismissive looks, the condescending questions. So she stayed silent, trapped in her growing terror. The following nights followed a similar pattern. Each night, the man would be there, standing across the street, his presence growing more menacing, his proximity to her window increasing with each passing night. And then, the tapping began. It started subtly, a faint, rhythmic tapping against her window pane. At first, Alice dismissed it as a branch brushing against the glass, but the sound persisted, growing louder, more insistent. Fear gnawed at her insides, her mind racing with terrifying possibilities. One night, Alice worked up the courage to peek through the curtains. The man was directly beneath her window now, his face almost pressed against the glass. His smile was a grotesque parody of human expression, his eyes reflecting a disturbing intensity. His finger tapped rhythmically against the glass, a steady beat that seemed to reverberate in Alice's very bones. Alice stumbled backward, her heart threatening to burst out of her chest. She fumbled for her phone, her fingers trembling so badly she could barely dial. She needed to call for help. She needed to get out of there. Section 5. A sense of dread. But who would believe her? Who would understand the sheer terror that gripped her heart? Alice paced her apartment, her fear a living, breathing entity that filled every corner of her small space. The tapping continued relentlessly, a maddening soundtrack to her growing despair. It was a relentless reminder of the smiling man outside, a constant threat lurking just beyond the thin pane of glass that separated her from the darkness. Days turned into nights, and the man's presence became a terrifying constant in Alice's life. She became a prisoner in her own home, too afraid to venture outside, too terrified to even look out her window. The tapping, however, remained. It became a part of her existence, a chilling reminder that she was not alone, that she was being watched, hunted. One particularly dark and stormy night, Alice lay in bed, unable to sleep. The wind howled outside and rain lashed against her windows, but it was the incessant tapping that held her captive in its grip. Then she heard it. A whisper, barely audible above the storm, seemed to come from right outside her window. "Let me in," it hissed, the voice raspy and chillingly close. Alice's blood ran cold. Her heart hammered against her ribs, her breath caught in her throat. "Let me in," the voice rasped again, closer this time, sending shivers down her spine. Alice squeezed her eyes shut, willing herself to disappear, to wake up from this nightmare. But the voice persisted, growing louder, more insistent. "Let me in, Alice," it hissed, the name sending a fresh wave of terror through her. He knew her name. How did he know her name? Alice's eyes flew open as a terrifying thought pierced through her terror. The voice. It hadn't come from outside. It had come from inside her apartment. She slowly sat up in bed, her gaze darting around the room, searching the darkness for the source of the voice. Her breath hitched in her throat as she noticed something in the reflection of her window. A figure stood behind her, shrouded in the shadows of the room. It was the man from the street, his smile even wider, more menacing in the darkness. His eyes glinted with an unholy light, and his voice, a raspy whisper, sent chills down her spine. "I told you to let me in," he hissed, his breath hot on her neck. Alice's mind reeled. How had he gotten in? What did he want? Alice's body froze, paralyzed by fear. She couldn't scream, couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The man's presence filled the room, a suffocating aura of menace and dread. "You've been watching me," Alice whispered, her voice trembling. The man chuckled, a low guttural sound that sent shivers down her spine. "I've been watching you, Alice," he replied, taking a step closer, his smile widening. "And now, you're going to watch me." Alice's mind raced, desperately searching for an escape, but the man's words held a terrifying finality. She was trapped, alone with this thing, in the confines of her own home. The man's grin stretched wider, revealing rows of teeth that seemed too sharp, too numerous to be human. His eyes, burning with an unnatural intensity, held her captive in their gaze. "No more hiding, Alice," the man whispered, his voice a chilling caress. He reached out, his hand unnaturally cold, brushed against her cheek. Alice flinched away, a scream finally escaping her lips. But it was too late. The man was upon her, his smile a grotesque mask of malice, his eyes burning into her very soul. The room seemed to spin, the walls closing in, as the man's laughter, filled with a chilling delight, echoed in her ears. Alice closed her eyes, surrendering to the darkness that awaited her. From that night forward, Alice was never seen again. The smiling man, however, remained a fixture in the neighborhood. His chilling grin, a haunting reminder that some doors are best left unopened, some smiles best left unreturned. And somewhere, in the shadows of the city, a whisper echoed in the darkness. Let me in.
The shadows are restless tonight, and so are we. If you're brave enough, hit that like button. Let us know what you think in the comments, and subscribe for more spine-tingling stories that lurk just around the corner.